Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Billahi that walillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra-subdivision B, the judgment, meta-section delta, judgment of the notion. Encyclopedia section 178. The judgment of the notion has for its content the notion, the totality in simple form, the universal with its complete speciality. The subject is 1. In the first place, an individual which has for its predicate the or the reflection of the particular existence on its universal, or the judgment states the agreement or disagreement of these two aspects. That is, the predicate is such a term as good, true, correct. This is the assertory judgment. Judgments such as whether an object, action, and the like is good, bad, true, beautiful, and the like are those to which even ordinary language first applies the name of judgment. We should never ascribe judgment to a person who framed positive or negative judgments like, this rose is red, this picture is red, green, dusty, and the like. The assertory judgment, although rejected by society as out of place when it claims authority on its own showing, has, however, been made the single and all essential form of doctrine, even in philosophy, through the influence of the principle of immediate knowledge and faith. In the so-called philosophic works which maintain this principle, we may read hundreds and hundreds of assertions about reason, knowledge, thought, and the like, which, now that external authority counts for little, seek to accredit themselves by an endless restatement, of the same thesis. Encyclopedia section 179. On the part of its at first unmediated subject, the assertory judgment does not contain the relation of particular with universal which is expressed in the predicate. This judgment is consequently a mere subjective particularity and is confronted by a contrary assertion with equal right, or rather want of right. It is therefore at once turned into number two, a problematical judgment. So number one, accessory judgment. Number two, a problematical judgment. But when we explicitly attach the objective particularity to the subject and make its speciality the constitutive features of its existence, the subject, number three, then expresses the connection of that objective particularity with its constitution. In essence, with its genus. And remember, there's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And I didn't mispronounce speciality. I said speciality, which is that which follows genus. Again, number 3, then expresses the connection of that objective particularity with its constitution, in essence, with its genus, and thus expresses what forms the content of the predicate. See Encyclopedia section 178. This, the immediate individuality, house the genus, being so and so constituted, particularity is good or bad. This is the apodictic judgment. And New Oxford American Dictionary defines apodictic formally formally. It means clearly established or beyond dispute. Its origin is the mid-17th century via Latin from the Greek apodiktikos, from apo de kunema, or kuneme, or apo de nune, show off, demonstrate. Another form of it is apodisis, or apo, apodosis. It is a noun, uh, and in grammar, it means the main consequent clause of a conditional sentence. Ergo, or such as, I would agree in, if you ask me, I would agree. It is often contrasted with protasis. So going back up to number 3, then expresses the connection of that objective particularity with its constitution, in essence, with its genus, and thus expresses what forms the content of the predicate. This, the immediate individuality, house the genus, being so and so constituted particularity, is good or bad. This is the apodictic judgment. All things are a genus, in essence, have a meaning and purpose in an individual actuality of a particular constitution, and they are finite because the particular in them may and also may not conform to the universal. Encyclopedia section 180. In this manner, subject and predicate are each the whole judgment. The immediate constitution of the subject is at first exhibited as the intermediating ground where the individuality of the actual thing meets with its universality, and in this way as the ground of the judgment. What has been really made explicit is the oneness of subject and predicate as the notion itself, filling up the empty is of the copula, while its constituent elements are at the same time distinguished as subject and predicate. The notion is put as their unity, as the connection which serves to intermediate them, in short, as the syllogism. And at this point, in chapter 9, getting toward the middle end of the chapter, we approach what everyone considers logic, the syllogism. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi dhat wa lillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra-subdivision C, the syllogism. Encyclopedia section 181. The syllogism brings the notion and the judgment into one. It is notion, being the simple identity into which the distinctions of form in the judgment have retired. It is judgment, because it is at the same time set in reality, that is, put in the distinction of its terms. The syllogism is the reasonable and everything reasonable. Even the ordinary theories represent the syllogism to be the form of reasonableness, but only a subjective form. And no interconnection whatever is shown to exist between it and any other reasonable content, such as a reasonable principle, a reasonable action, idea, and the like. The name of reason is much and often heard and appealed to, but no one thinks of explaining its specific character or saying what it is, least of all that it has any connection with syllogism. But formal syllogism really presents what is reasonable in such a reasonless way that it has nothing to do, with any reasonable matter. But as the matter in question can only be rational in virtue of the same quality by which thought is reason, it can be made so by the form only, and that form is syllogism. And what is a syllogism but an explicit putting? In essence, realizing of the notion. At first, in form only, as stated above. And what is a syllogism but an explicit putting? In essence, realizing of the notion. At first, in form only, as stated above. Accordingly, the syllogism is the essential ground of whatever is true. And at the present stage, the definition of the absolute is that it is the syllogism, or stating the principle in a proposition. Everything is a syllogism. Everything is a notion, the existence of which is the differentiation of its members or functions, so that the universal nature of the notion gives itself external reality by means of particularity, and thereby, and as a negative reflection into itself, makes itself an individual. Or, conversely, the actual thing is an individual, which by means of particularity rises to universality and makes itself identical with itself. The actual is one, but it is also the divergence from each other of the constituent elements of the notion. And the syllogism represents the orbit of intermediation of its elements by which it realizes unity. The syllogism like the notion and the judgment, is usually described as a form merely of our subjective thinking. The syllogism, it is said, is the process of providing. The syllogism, it is said, is the process of proving the judgment. And certainly, the judgment does in every case refer us to the syllogism. The step from the one to the other, however, is not brought about by our subjective action, but by the judgment itself, which puts itself as syllogism, and in the conclusion returns to the unity of the notion. The precise point by which we pass to the syllogism is found in the apodictic judgment. In it, we have an individual which, by means of its qualities, connects itself with its universal or notion. Here we see the particular becoming the mediating mean between the individual and the universal. This gives the fundamental form of the syllogism, the gradual specification of which, formally considered, consists in the fact that universal and individual also occupy this place of mean. This again paves the way for the passage from subjectivity to objectivity. Encyclopedia section 182. In the immediate syllogism, the several aspects of the notion confront one another abstractly and stand in an external relation only. We have first the two extremes, which are individuality and universality, and then the notion as the mean for locking the two together is in like manner only abstract particularity. In this way, the extremes are put as independent and without affinity either towards one another or towards their mean. Such a syllogism contains reason, but in utter notionlessness, the formal syllogism of understanding. In it, the subject is coupled with an other character, or the universal by this mediation subsumes a subject external to it. In the rational syllogism, on the contrary, the subject is by means of the mediation coupled with itself. In this manner, it first comes to be a subject, or in the subject we have the first germ of the rational syllogism. In the following examination, the syllogism of understanding, according to the interpretation usually put upon it, is expressed in its subjective shape, the shape which it has when we are said to make such syllogisms, and it really is only a subjective syllogizing. Such syllogism, however, has also an objective meaning. It expresses only the finitude of things, but does so in the specific mode which the form has here reached. In the case of finite things, their subjectivity, being only thinghood, is separable from their properties or their particularity, but also separable from their universality. Not only when the universality is the bare quality of the thing, and its external interconnection with other things, but also when it is its genus and notion. On the above-mentioned theory of syllogism, as the rational form par excellence, reason has been defined as the faculty of syllogizing, whilst understanding is defined as the faculty of forming notions. We might object to the conception on which this depends, and according to which the mind is merely a sum of forces or faculties existing side by side. But apart from that objection, we may observe in regard to the parallelism of understanding with the notion, as well as of reason with syllogism, that the notion is as little a mere category of the understanding as the syllogism is without qualification definable as rational. But apart from that objection, we may observe in regard to the parallelism of understanding with the notion, as well as of reason with syllogism, that the notion is as little a mere category of the understanding as the syllogism is without qualification definable as rational. For, in the first place, what the formal logic usually examines in its theory of syllogism is really nothing but the mere syllogism of understanding, which has no claim to the honor of being made a form of rationality, still less to be held as the embodiment of all reason. The notion, in the second place, so far from being a form of understanding, owes its degradation to such a place entirely to the influence of that abstract mode of thought. And it is not unusual to draw such a distinction between a notion of understanding and a notion of reason. The distinction, however, does not mean that notions are of two kinds. It means that our own action often stops short at the mere negative and abstract form of the notion, when we might also have proceeded to apprehend the notion in its true nature as at once positive and concrete. It is, ergo, the mere understanding which thinks liberty to be the abstract contrary of necessity, whereas the adequate rational notion of liberty requires the element of necessity to be merged in it. Similarly, the definition of God given by what is called deism is merely the mode in which the understanding thinks God, whereas Christianity, to which he is known as the Trinity, contains the rational notion of God. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi that wa lillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra-subdivision C, the syllogism, meta-section alpha, qualitative syllogism. Encyclopedia section 183. The first syllogism is a syllogism of definite being, a qualitative syllogism. The first syllogism is a syllogism of definite being, a qualitative syllogism, as stated in the last paragraph. It forms its form 1 is I m dash p m dash u colon. In essence, a subject as individual is coupled, concluded with a universal character by means of a particular quality. Of course, the subject, terminus minor, has other characteristics besides individuality, just as the other extreme, the predicate of the conclusion or terminus major, has other characteristics than mere universality. But here the interest turns only on the characteristics through which these terms make a syllogism. The syllogism of existence is a syllogism of understanding, merely, at least in so far as it leaves the individual, the particular, and the universal to confront each other quite abstractly. In this syllogism, the notion is at the very height of self-estrangement. We have in it an immediately individual thing as subject. Next, some one particular aspect or property attaching to this subject is selected, and by means of this property, the individual turns out to be a universal. Thus, we may say, this rose is red. Red is a color. Therefore, this rose is a colored object. It is this aspect of the syllogism which the common logics mainly treat of. There was a time when the syllogism was regarded as an absolute rule for all cognition, and when a scientific statement was not held to be valid until it had been shown to follow from a process of syllogism. At present, on the contrary, the different forms of the syllogism are met nowhere save in the manuals of logic, and an acquaintance with them is considered a piece of mere pedantry, of no further use either in practical life or in science. It would indeed be both useless and pedantic to parade the whole machinery of the formal syllogism on every occasion, and yet the several forms of syllogism make themselves make themselves constantly felt in our cognition. If any one, when awaking on a winter morning, hears the creaking of the carriages on the street, and is thus led to conclude that it has frozen hard in the night, he has gone through a syllogistic operation, an operation which is every day repeated under the greatest variety of conditions. The interest, therefore, ought at least not to be less in becoming expressly conscious of this daily action of our thinking selves than confessedly belongs to the study of the study of the functions of organic life. such as the processes of digestion, assimilation, respiration, or even the processes and structures of the nature around us. We do not, however, for a moment deny that a study of logic is no more necessary to teach us how to draw correct conclusions than a previous study of anatomy and physiology is required in order to digest or breathe. Before I read the next section, I'll give you a hint at the tone of it. Uh, Aristotle, uh, called Divine Aristotle, is very likely a man from what is now Albania, and he had some influence on the thinking of Alexander the Great. Aristotle was a student of Plato, who we call Divine Plato, one of his chief students, and at some point in their relationship, he broke with his teacher, who he learned a tremendous amount from, and criticized him. Though he carried forward almost everything he learned from him, and of course made his own modifications, which many people find to be extremely advantageous. The question in the next section is whether or not the expression of logic, the presentation of logic that Aristotle gives us, which leads to the physics, and that which comes after physics, the application, which we term metaphysics, came from Plato, or it originated with Aristotle and possibly other teachers. This is the same conversation, though a bit different, that we get with Plato as he talks about Socrates. Some of the notions of Plato have been said to be his originally, others are said to be Socrates's, and of course, another teacher or other teachers he may have taken with. One chiefly is his grandfather, the king or the king of Athens, who studied in Egypt at a point, and brought back many different ideas and understandings and translations. One of them, the story of Atlantis. And Plato says something about Atlantis when he begins to talk about it, not in some of the texts where he mentions it briefly, but in the Critias, where he talks about it at length. He says, the event I am about to describe occurred 9,000 years before today. And he lived, or said that, around the year 550 before the Common Era, or BC, before Christ, before Jesus Christ is said to have been born, um, which is conveniently, whether or not it is when he was born, the year one of our era. We are in the year 2022. So the year one was 2021 years ago. And so Atlantis would be or would have fallen due to natural climate concerns in the year 9,500 before the Common Era. Now, some people find that strange that Plato knows that. I can tell you that 10,000 years ago, in the year 8,000 BC, there were people in the Arabian Peninsula, and specifically in the area which is now Jordan and Iraq, but Jordan, I know for sure, who created houses and had religion and had other functions and left some form of information there for us to detect. I know this beyond my reading because I've been there. and I've seen it, and I've walked into one of their caves and saw the area where the archaeologists and other scientists came to understand this information. So I can tell you something from 10,000 years ago, and if we understand the great ability of Plato and the people around him compared to the people who are here today, and we have some great people here today too, maybe he was just as rare. Uh, it is possible that Plato knew through the Egyptian records, which themselves went back to about 4000 BC, and of course before, what had happened in Atlantis. He knew, the Egyptians knew because an individual came to them to teach them about what happened, let's say around the year 4000 BC, and he called himself Thoth the Atlantean. Now, everything I said conforms what we now know of as history. History is the process of recording information in writing and discussing it. However, for the Egyptians to have known the stories, well, not for them to have known, there are other ways they could have known, but the Egyptians did not meet Thoth, the Atlantean, in the year 4000 BC. The Egyptians, the people who were there, very likely Bantu people who are darker skinned individuals, nearing black to brown, they would have met this lighter reddish skinned individual called Thoth around the year, sometime after the year 9500. He would have remembered the fall of Atlantis, and he would have remembered everything that occurred there, likely had it recorded somewhere. We could argue that they had exceptional memories or they had writing, and it was all flooded away and devastated as if everything now we have is written on computers. If there were a solar flare or some other occurrence that wiped out all of the information we have on the internet, all of this speaking that I'm doing, the writing that's attached to it, is gone. Uh, he would have possibly had some of it with him, or at least he knew it's part of it and he re recorded it. And he eventually, after landing in what is now the United Kingdom, Britannia specifically, Britain, and setting up a new Atlantic Republic there, a new Atlantis, likely also or possibly also in the coastal regions of Portugal and possibly Spain, and in northern Africa, it's from Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia. They eventually reached Egypt, where there were people who lived and had some form of rulership or monarchy uh, culture, and he kindly talks about how he subdues them. You'll find this in the emerald tablets of Thoth, the Semardine tablets of Thoth. You'll find them there, green. There, this is the name of it, and so and it was a piece of writing that he left there, so it would always exist. And he brought this to them. He said he had a device that when the people would, they were all rushing toward him to either attack or overspeak him. And he said he raised a stick and a vibration went over the people and they were submissive to his statement. The closest thing to that would be if you were to take a microphone and hold it toward a speaker, that type of sound that kind of stops everyone in their place. And a primitive device, since we need to kind of imagine it to be a primitive device, would be a rattle. There's a type of rattle that long stick, almost like the ones they have in Australia. It's full of maybe a sand or some other sound, maybe rocks, and you at an angle rock it back and forth, away from yourself, but where it reaches over the crowd and the collective sound vibration of it can cause people to be calm. And he says that the hairy barbarians were calm at that point. Uh, it is just as possible that if they weren't people from the central part of Africa who were in Egypt, they could have been, who were dark skinned and black, they could have been people from Europe who had white skin and were quite hairy, who were in Egypt. It could have been white skinned people and black skinned people in Egypt at that time. And these red people came over from Atlantis, which is now the United States and Canada, possibly Central and South America, where they've been for 36,000 years. And there was a great flood that occurred there around 9,500 uh, BCE, and possibly before, about 12,000 years ago. So there was a flood, and it's cyclical that these floods occur. So we have this information from Plato and his ability to reason, and then Aristotle would have had it as well, having either a true argument against Plato or making an attempt to not infringe on the copyright or the trademark or the patents of Plato. He distinguished his philosophy and his writings to be something else. So there's other reasons. So the next section here is a bit strange in the what we've read already in the previous 8 chapters and even in this chapter 9, because it offers a what sounds like a cynical critique in reality, well, and it may very well be, but I wanted to give you a bit of background on why. In Hegel, being a peripatetic, as they are called, possibly even myself, a person who considers Plato divine. And divine is a title given to one who has transcended his human nature and become something that you know will survive for a very long time. And so far, we've had Plato for 2,500 or so years, and he very well may continue to survive. We would also apply divine to Aristotle because he survived around that time and influenced Alexander the Great, who maybe lived 100 or so years after him. And there's another person who we won't likely get to, named Iamblichus, who lived in around the year 300 AD, right before the Council of Nicaea was formed, who wrote an extensive text called the Chaldean Oracles, usually, which discusses all of the formal ways in which you should interact with extra simian beings. For instance, for things that some people call gods, some people will call ghosts, some people call king or queen, and many other figures. He gives the etiquette to interact with them, and in doing so, lays out something very similar to a Confucianism for all beings currently known. If you want to get a bit of an experience of what that feels like, there is a book by Umberto Eco, who has passed away not terribly long ago, called Baldolino, Baldilino, where he goes through some of the classical beings that were believed to have existed and people interacted with upon the earth. Okay, so I did that in part because I'm a big believer in etiquette, and I now will read this part that we're going into. Aristotle called Aristo aristocrat. Aristotle is what Aristotle means. He's an aristocrat, a high-ranking person, as was Plato, but not Socrates, as far as we know. Divine Aristotle was the first to observe and describe the different forms or as they are called, figures of syllogism in their subjective meaning, and he performed his work so exactly and surely that no essential addition has ever been required. But while sensible of the value of what he has thus done, we must not forget that the forms of the syllogism of understanding and of finite thought altogether are not what Aristotle has made use of in his properly philosophical investigations. See ahead, section 189. What did this criticism make me think of? A mistake that I've made. I said that I'm calling these encyclopedia paragraphs, and then I'll say encyclopedia section. And then at some point I said it'll say encyclopedia section, let's say 138, and the note. And I'll say something like, oh, it means the first paragraph, and then the following paragraphs are the note. I am incorrect in that. Uh, Assuming you're listening to this on YouTube, if you check in the description, you'll see, or you'll now see, because I've corrected it since I began recording, you'll now see a link to the Project Gutenberg text on the logic of Hegel, which I'm reading as a document uploaded to my Kindle for PC, again, through my Meta Luxottica Ray-Ban Stories smart glasses. And if you click on there, you'll notice that many of the encyclopedia sections do have notes. So if there are places where it says, section 184 in the note, then that means at the very end of the text, there are notes included, which take you into even further detail. So you're writing a paper or something else, and you've listened to this, uh, or you've been reading it, and you come to some part of this, you'll realize now that if you need a further explanation, or just say you've heard enough of Hegel for now, and you want to know something about these other writers, in encyclopedia section, or in the section 3, which is the philosophy of the mind, he is a bit more critical of his contemporaries than he is in the Encyclopedia of Logic. So it may be that you've heard of someone already spoken of, uh, and you haven't listened to part 3, that you want to learn more about them. He offers more in the notes. And so I advise you to go to the Project Gutenberg version of the book, which is linked, or Project Gutenberg on Google, and type in Hegel, and it will come up with a list of other texts that he has as well. So I made a mistake, and in hearing about how Aristotle didn't use the syllogistic properties as well as he could have in his philosophical investigations, means that it wasn't as logical as it could have been. He's given a critique of Aristotle at that point, and I took it. Aris, or my name is Christopher Cuddies, and so I took it as hey, you may have made a mistake somewhere, to myself, and made a correction. The two names in Greek have an overlapping meaning. Charis comes from goddess, comes from a Coptic Egyptian word, so a Greco-Egyptian word, meaning illuminated, uh, bright, illuminated, and Aris comes from in Egyptian Arabic. You don't pronounce the Q sound, the qaf. So qaris, even though it's ch, it's qaris, so it would be a Q sound, Qi, a Q or Qar, qaris. So Aristotle is Aristotle, goddess, total, uh, and fully illuminated is what the name would be. Aristotle, Aristofer. someone who is carrying a full illumination. So kind of a step, a permutation away from being fully illuminated to carrying a full illumination. And charis or Yeso charis, Yeso Christo, uh, Yesu Christo, Jesus Christ is one who uh, a God who carries a full illumination, if you will, is what that name means. Not me, thankfully. I'm happy to carry a full illumination in my reading of this text and whatever else I'm able to carry forward. Okay, moving ahead to Encyclopedia section 184. Encyclopedia section 184. This syllogism is completely contingent, and for section alpha, this syllogism is completely contingent in the matter of its terms. The middle term, being an abstract particularity, is nothing but any quality, whatever of the subject. But the subject, being immediate and thus empirically concrete, has several others, and could therefore be coupled with exactly as many other universalities as it possesses single qualities. Similarly, a single particularity may have various characters in itself, so that the same medius terminus would serve to connect the subject with several different universals. It is more a caprice of fashion than a sense of incorrectness which has led to the disuse of ceremonious syllogizing. This and the following section indicate the uselessness of such syllogizing for the ends of truth. The point of view indicated in the paragraph shows how this style of syllogism can demonstrate, as the phrase goes, the most diverse conclusions. All that is requisite is to find a medius terminus from which the transition can be made to the proposition sought. Another medius terminus would enable us to demonstrate something else, and even the contrary of the last. And the more concrete an object is, the more aspect it has, which may become such middle terms. To determine which of these aspects is more essential than another, again requires a further syllogism of this kind, which, fixing on the single quality, can with equal ease discover in it some aspects or consideration by which it can make good its claims to be considered necessary and important. Little as we usually think on the syllogism of understanding in the daily business of life, it never ceases to play its part there. In a civil suit, for instance, it is the duty of the advocate to give due force to the legal titles which make in favor of his client. In logical language, such a legal title is nothing but a middle term. Diplomatic transition Diplomatic transactions afford another illustration of the same. When, for instance, different powers lay claim to one and the same territory, in such a case, the laws of inheritance, the geographical position of the country, the descent and the language of its inhabitants, or any other ground may be emphasized as a medius terminus. Encyclopedia section 185, infrasection beta. This syllogism, if it is contingent in points of its terms, is no less contingent in virtue of the form of relation which is found in it. In the syllogism, according to its notion, truth lies in connecting two distinct things by a middle term in which they are one. But connections of the extremes with the middle term, the so-called premises, the major and the minor premise, are in the case of this syllogism much more decidedly immediate connections. In other words, they have not a proper middle term. This contradiction in the syllogism exhibits a new case of the infinite progression. Each of the premises evidently calls for a fresh syllogism to demonstrate it. And as the new syllogism has two immediate premises, like its predecessor, the demand for proof is doubled at every step and repeated without end. Encyclopedia section 186. On account of its importance for experience, there has been here noted a defect in the syllogism, to which, in this form, absolute correctness had been ascribed. This defect, however, must lose itself in the further specification of the syllogism, for we are now within the sphere of the notion. And here, therefore, as well as in the judgment, the opposite character is not merely present potentially, but is explicit. Though to work out the gradual specification of the syllogism, therefore, there need only be admitted and accepted what is at each step realized by the syllogism itself. Through the immediate syllogism, I, M-P, M-U, IPU, the not CPU, IPU, the individual is mediated through a particular with the universal. The computer is mediated with a particular through the universal. Through the immediate syllogism, IPU, the individual is mediated through a particular with the universal, and in this conclusion, put as a universal, it follows that the individual subject, becoming itself a universal, serves to unite the two extremes and to form their ground of intermediation. This gives the second figure of the syllogism, 2, or number 2, UIP. It expresses the truth of the first. It shows, in other words, that the intermediation has taken place in the individual and is thus something contingent.